Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for coming out tonight. My name is Anna, and on behalf of the Global Education Network Graduate Students Group and the Palestine Solidarity Network, I'd like to welcome you to this evening's event. The first event to kick off Israeli Apartheid Week here in Edmonton. So, just to give you a brief intro about what Israeli Apartheid Week is. It was first launched in Toronto in 2005 and has grown to become one of the most important events on the Palestine Solidarity calendar. So this year, events are happening in dozens of cities across Canada and in about 40 cities around the world, including a number of cities within Palestine. The IAW events are intended to raise awareness on the university campus about the human rights abuses affecting the Palestinian people, and they offer ways for students and Edmontonians in the broader community to act in solidarity with them. So, before I introduce tonight's speaker, I'd just like to make a few short comments. The organizers of the event feel that it is extremely important to recognize that as we gather today for this event, we assert our opposition to apartheid and our solidarity with struggles for dignity and self-determination in Palestine. We feel we cannot speak meaningfully about Israeli apartheid without acknowledging the realities of apartheid within our own country. So, Canada's reservation system and treatment of Indigenous peoples was closely studied by the planners of apartheid in South Africa, though this may be a hidden chapter in our history. We recognize that from its very beginning, the founding of Canada was built on the theft of Indigenous lands and the genocide and displacement of Indigenous peoples. In crucial ways, the Canadian state's treatment of Indigenous peoples, historically and currently, can be described as an apartheid system. To stolen children and residential schools, from the imposition of the Indian Act, from the continued theft of lands and resources by governments and corporations, and to the cultural appropriation of native traditions and cultures. So the contemporary struggle for survival being waged by a number of Indigenous communities in northern Alberta, and the staggering gap in access to healthcare, clean water, and other basic human rights for First Nations people in Canada illustrate that in critical ways, this system continues to exist in Canada today. If you are with us in opposition to Israeli apartheid, we encourage you to be consistent in opposition to elements that are of a similar system right here in Canada. We also feel it's extremely important to recognize that Israeli apartheid week is being met with a lot of opposition across the country and has been stifled by censorship. So at University of Ottawa and Carleton University, IAW posters were banned on campus. And at York University, the organizing group was suspended, preventing all IAW events from even occurring. Here on campus, we have been met with opposition, definitely. Systematically, we've seen our posters been torn down, and some of them have been defaced. But, however, we'd like to acknowledge that despite all of this, and some groups' opposition and attempts to shut down the Apartheid Week, the University of Alberta has remained committed to the principles of academic freedom and discourse on this important issue. And for that, we highly commend them and thank them for that. We'd like to recommend that if you have appreciated the space that this week has provided and the discussion that's been offered, to email the university administration and just reiterate those same things, thanking them for supporting freedom of speech and for academic freedom. So you can look up their email address on the U of A website. Finally, in the interest of having an open dialogue, we'd like to stress that the organizers of the event urge all participants to engage in these issues in a respectful manner. So we categorically reject and will not in any way tolerate instances of Islamophobic, anti-Semitic, or other racist behavior during the week's events. So having said all of that, I would like to introduce Layla El-Haddad, who is our speaker this evening. Layla is a freelance Palestinian journalist, media activist, and mother from Gaza, who writes mainly for The Guardian Unlimited and Al Jazeera English. She maintains the award-winning blog, Raising Yosef and Noor, Diary of a Palestinian Mother, and you can see them running around tonight. And this explores the complex relationships between the personal and political as she raises her children and negotiates displacement and occupation. She is currently based in the United States with her husband, a Palestinian refugee from the ethnically cleansed village of Warit al-Siris. And Laila has also been published in Le Monde Diplomatique, The New Statesman, the International Herald Tribune, and the Washington Post, among others. She has also made appearances on CNN, NPR, CBC, Democracy Now!, Al Jazeera International, and the BBC. So I invite you to welcome Laila El-Hakim.
Thank you all for coming this evening. I encourage anyone who thinks I'm going too fast at any point. I tend to go on fast forwards sometimes just to raise your hand. But I want to actually start with these two boys. This is Muhammad and Ahmed. They're about 8 and 10 years old. It was taken in September. All the pictures that you'll see are taken September 2005. It was about a day or two after Israeli troops completed their disengagement, what was called the disengagement, from the Gaza Strip. At that time, Israeli Prime Minister Ariel Sharon had masterminded this disengagement. I saw them. I was reporting. I was covering the disengagement. This is along the border between the Gaza Strip and Egypt. You can see a map there, but I'll show you it in a second. And they were just sort of speaking to each other in hushed whispers. And then there was a man said to me, they're wondering, they've never left Gaza, and they're wondering what it looks like. And so one of them said to me, what does the world beyond Gaza look like? And then the other one said, how does an Egyptian look? And for those not familiar with the geography, where they're standing is about 10 meters away from Egypt. And for a few fleeting days, the disengagement provided these two young boys and millions of Palestinians in Gaza to, for the first time in as much as 30 years, reunite with family members that they were divided from in 1967 on the Egyptian side of the town of Rafah, to leave Gaza for those Palestinians who lack the proper permits and IDs that Israel issues, that it uses to control the movement of Palestinians, and for Palestinians on the outside of Gaza to come and visit and see Gaza. And I was sort of struck because this was 2005. We're not talking about today. We often hear about how isolated Gaza is, what a prison it has become. Though as a friend who works for Human Rights Watch points out, prisoners are guaranteed certain rights, like food and electricity and medical care. Palestinians in Gaza are not guaranteed any of those things. This was 2005, and this was how isolated Gaza was. Now we're in 2009. This was before elections. This was after disengagement. So I want to sort of move from there, just start out with that context, that framework of Gaza's isolation having come full circle over the past decade. It's not something that just started a year or two ago or a few months ago. Over the past decade, since the Oslo Accords, and where we've come to today. To Gaza, which has, as I mentioned, become one of the most isolated places on Earth. An occupied territory, still recognized as occupied, that's nevertheless deemed hostile. The Israeli government voted to refer to it as a hostile entity, which absolves it of legal responsibilities. And on top of that, so it's an occupied territory, the majority of Gaza's refugees is deemed a hostile territory, and on top of that, it's subject to a deliberate boycott. It's a place where electricity, fuel, the water you drink every day, the air you breathe, the foods that you buy, the diapers you put your children in my case when I was there, all of these things are dependent on an outside power. Where your ability to move, and I should add many of these things are also applied to the West Bank, so there's many parallels. Your ability to move, your ability to study, we're at the university here to study, your ability to work, whether in or outside of Gaza, your ability to receive urgent medical care for many rare diseases and otherwise, where all of these things, where the way you live your life to the very personal, all of these things are controlled by an invisible occupying power that at the same time claims it is not controlling you. It is not controlling you. That it is not in charge of your destiny. That it is no longer responsible for all of these things or for the way you live your life. Today, despite disengagement, despite all of the things that we hear, Gaza has become more isolated than ever before. And again, a situation that has been in the making for over a decade and sort of has come full circle in the past few years. One more thing that I'm going to preface the talk with, I want you to keep in mind, it's again, in the context of a concept coined by the late Israeli sociologist Baruch Kimmerling, politicide. What is politicide? It's a gradual but systematic attempt to cause the annihilation of an independent political and social entity. It is the crushing of the Palestinian resistance, and ultimately the making of the creation of a viable Palestinian state impossible to attain. This has been the overriding concept that has shaped Israeli policy towards Palestinians for the past few decades. Long before the Palestinian elections, in which Hamas won fair and square, long before the current invasion or the siege of the past few years. I'm going to kind of backtrack, having said all that. I was born in Kuwait. My parents are my father from Gaza City, my mother from Khan Yunis. In the 1960s, as with many Palestinians, they went to Egypt. They studied medicine. They returned to Gaza just after the 1967 war. They were lucky because the Red Cross was able to guarantee them access back to their own homes because doctors were in urgent need. Most other Palestinians who were outside of the occupied territories, what later would become the occupied territories, immediately lost their right to return to their own homes. Israel ran a population census. If you weren't in Gaza, the West Bank, or East Jerusalem, you were not issued what's called a Hawiyah, an ID card that Israel then began to use to control the movement of Palestinians, and you were no longer considered Palestinian. This is in the words of the Israeli spokesperson that's in charge of administering these documents. So my parents were able to get back. They lived there for several years. They worked there. Life became increasingly difficult, especially for physicians, Palestinian physicians at that time. The civil administration was governed by Israel. They sought work, as many Palestinians, in the Arabian Gulf, where I was born. And every year they would return to Gaza for the next 15 years to renew this document, because if they did not, they would lose their right to return to their own homes. And so we went with them, and as children, of course, never quite understood why we had to suffer just to go to visit a place that to us, seemed so remote and so, and we were sort of comfortable where my parents were working in this private compound, and we would go endure long strip searches and 24-hour journeys through, at that point, the Allenby Bridge between Jordan and Israel, and then from there go to Gaza. And it would be like a 2-day ordeal, and it was traumatizing for young children. Eventually, my parents retired, and they moved back to Gaza, where they are today. I went on, and I completed my studies, and after finishing my graduate degree, I had an opportunity to work as a stringer for the then nascent Al Jazeera network, which had just launched its English website. So I went back, I was newly pregnant, and I just sort of dove into it. It was a great opportunity that I could finally go back home and also work there. This was in the fall of 2003. It was just a few days after Israel had completed what it referred to as Operation Rainbow. Whoever comes up with these euphemistic names of these operations, these military campaigns. It was waged against the southern Gaza town of Rafah, which we've heard a lot in recent days. It sort of bore the brunt of a lot of the Israeli military campaigns in the second World War. And I went there, I went to cover what was happening in Rafah. I got stuck, the town was surrounded, and couldn't get out for the night, and I was about 5 or 6 months pregnant. That was my first. Those were my first few days back into Gaza, and I would continue to cover everything and learn a lot. But what sort of became a defining moment was one day I went, and every 4 to 6 months I would go back to visit my husband, who was in the U.S. I should mention he is, as was mentioned, a Palestinian refugee. He was born and raised in a refugee camp in Baalbek in Lebanon. His grandparents were evicted from their homes near Haifa, from the village of Warta Cities, which was one of over 400 Palestinian villages that were ethnically cleansed. And he has Palestinian refugee status till this day. I have a Palestinian Authority passport. And he, as a refugee, is not allowed to come visit or reside in Gaza, anywhere in Palestine, in the West Bank, anywhere in the occupied territories, or in modern-day Israel, where his native home is. So he can't come with me. So I would go visit him, and then I gave birth to Yusuf, and he was 2 months old. Took him back with me to Gaza. Now we were supposed to go right to the border. We have to fly into Cairo. There's no other way to get into Gaza, and from there you go by land, 5 hours to the border. And I got a call from the taxi guy who kind of runs the circuit between Cairo and the border and said, look, the Israelis just closed the border. They never gave a reason why. We don't know when it's going to open again. And that would be the beginning of a 55-day wait for us, me and a few-month-old Yusuf in Cairo. And I waited, and it was just sort of this maddening experience, and where time stands still, and you have nowhere to go. And it was Mahmoud Darwish, the Palestinian poet, who once said, "The Palestinian belongs everywhere and nowhere at once." And you just feel like no one knows. You can't quite explain this feeling of always waiting. As a Palestinian, you're always waiting for something. It's not something to open, for a permit to be issued, for just waiting for a time where you don't have to wait anymore. And a cousin of mine said to me, "Why don't you keep a blog about Yusuf's development, just so you've seen his father, keep in touch with him?" So I had done that, and then over the course of those next few days, the blog became a little more political, and it was sort of this defining moment where I realized how personal and how pervasive the occupation was to Palestinians, and how then the personal, as the feminist group, the personal is political is personal, personal is political. And that was sort of the birth of the blog, and it was very small at first, and it sort of took off, and I think it provided people with a real window into Gaza, a window that we don't often see. We see a lot of the blood and the gore, and the images we see of Gaza are largely those of masked men with rockets and angry people chanting and things like that. It's death and destruction. But who are the people of Gaza, and what are the lives that are being affected here, and what is the larger picture, the gaps that are missing from the Gaza and the Palestine story in general? And that's sort of what my blog became about this very personal level that the occupation affects. So I'm just going to go through a few slides with you. This again is just a map I've got. You can see one up there, but you can ignore that little bubble. That was from the recent attack. But just giving you an idea, the Gaza Strip here on the Mediterranean, Israel over here, Egypt down there, and all of the various crossings I just want you to keep in mind when I refer to Kerem Shalom, Karni rather, the commercial crossing. There is the only crossing that you can take from Gaza through Israel to the West Bank and Jerusalem. And then Rafah down there, the only crossing that Palestinians in Gaza can take to Egypt and then to the outside world. So this is Gaza. And then you can see also, keep in mind the proximity to the West Bank. It's about an hour away. It's easier for me to come to Canada than it is to go to the West Bank or East Jerusalem for that matter. Part of this system of apartheid, why we keep hearing referred to as apartheid, is because of the way that the Israelis control the movement of the Palestinians depending on their location, depending on the kind of permit and ID they're holding. As I mentioned, my own husband can't come to Gaza. I can't go to the West Bank. Family members in the West Bank can't come visit us in Gaza. Academics, Ramallah is the academic stronghold of the Palestinian territories. Cannot go back and forth, cannot visit each other. Everything is done by video conference, including studying, including everything else. Can't go to Jerusalem. Can't pray in Jerusalem, can't do any of that. So, just quickly here, Gaza at a glance. 1.5 million people. It's going to go actually beyond that according to CIA estimates by the summer. Half of them, are under 14 years of age. And just think about Muhammad and Ahmed, those two boys I showed you in the beginning, who had never left the confines of their own refugee camp, who had never left the confines of Gaza Strip, who had never seen a human being outside of Gaza. So half the size of Edmonton, twice the population. Still occupied. This is important to remember. And I'll get to the definition of occupation as effective control. Occupation isn't just someone, military, being inside where you live. It's much more than that. It's not sovereign. It's a stateless entity. Over 70% are defined as refugees and the descendants of refugees from villages and towns surrounding the Gaza Strip, all around the Gaza Strip, south and east and north of the Gaza Strip. These are the homes of these people. And I talked about the crossings and the airport, very beautiful airport, which I had the pleasure of using twice before it was bombed, non-operational. So really, completely isolated. There's no way out, there's no way in. So I'm just going to breeze through these 3 slides. This is when I arrived, 2003, when I began reporting, and it was in the middle of the second intifada, 2003. And again, the reason I'm talking about this is because you're going to see a trend. You know, so much of the focus is on the current narrative that we hear about. You know, rockets were flying over your children's playgrounds. Gazans chose terror. They could have chosen to make their state flourish. So on and so forth. Well, let's backtrack and look a little at the kinds of things that were happening in 2003. Now, the Fatah government was in power at this time. The Camp David Accords did not happen. They did not meet the minimum of Palestinian demands. The result was the second intifada, and Israel was sort of punishing the Palestinian Authority and the Palestinians for that, for not being cooperative enough, not agreeing with their vision of limited Palestinian self-rule, of a non-viable Palestinian state. What was happening was mass house demolitions, systematic house demolitions. 2/3 of Palestinians in the Rafah refugee camp lost their homes to these house demolitions to create a buffer zone there. And there's a really lengthy report called Raising Rafah by Human Rights Watch that details this. Land clearing, over 20,000 trees were completely cleared and raised. And meanwhile, in the West Bank, the apartheid wall continued to snake its way around homes and annexing those homes and lands. And along with illegal settlements, annexed over 50% of Palestinian land there. Now, I should also mention the first things that were hit in the second intifada, were civilian infrastructure and the infrastructure of security and governance. So police stations, buildings belonging to Palestinian Authority. Why do I mention this? Because in January, the same thing happened. The first targets of the Gaza attacks were 40 young police officers graduating in a graduation ceremony, and then government buildings, and then ministries. And so you see this trend with this concept I was talking about, politicide, and the effort to sow chaos and lawlessness, to destroy the civilian infrastructure and that of governance and security in the Gaza Strip. And just some images here of the area of raised land along that border I was talking about, where the boys were peering over. This is a woman who her house had just been demolished. She was a refugee, so this was the second time she would become a refugee. She was just washing some dishes in school. This is a man who was walking past. Before the disengagement, there were these internal checkpoints in the Gaza Strip. And the occupation gradually became more and more invisible. What I mean by that is we would no longer physically see an Israeli soldier in front of us. They would sort of be cocooned in their sniper towers or their helicopter gunships or their F-16, things that we had never seen prior to the second intifada. We would actually see the physical presence of soldiers. We would never see helicopter gunships or F-16s or anything like that used against us. So we would just see a tower, and then we would hear someone from a megaphone telling us to stop, random shooting, and then if someone sort of was out of line, everybody would be made to wait 3 or 4 more hours until the soldier decided to let them go through again. In this case, this was one form of a checkpoint. It was a trench that they would dig every few weeks, and then people would just have to kind of walk all the way across it. No vehicular movement would be allowed. So this was just a man walking past the checkpoint. So now I'm going to get to the disengagement. Remember, that's that period I was talking about when I saw those 2 boys peering over, where it was a remarkable few weeks for Palestinians. And you'll see those in the images I'm going to show because, if for the first time, as I mentioned, suddenly there were not these internal barriers that we saw. Suddenly it didn't take us 4 hours to get from Gaza City to southern Gaza, where it's a 30-minute ride. And it was an incredible feeling. It was this euphoric feeling. Suddenly, there were no longer these fortified colonies in the middle of Gaza, sectioning Gaza apart, taking more than 2/3 of its land and its resources, and we could just move about freely. It was really something quite incredible. And it was a policy that defined the disengagement was unilateralism. You may have heard this. It was something the Israeli government, Ariel Sharon, thought of, that they will just begin to take actions on their own with no regard to Palestinians, no talking to them about what the policy means or how it's going to affect them. And that continued to shape Israeli policy till this day. Now, what do I mean by Gaza as a hamster cage? This was something someone once said to me, and it made a lot of sense. He said, think of the disengagement as Palestinians in Gaza are in this hamster cage with all these obstacles and wheels and whatnot. And what happened is those wheels and obstacles were removed, and the hamsters had this feeling of newfound freedom, forgetting for a little bit that they were still surrounded by a cage. And that's exactly what it was like. We wanted to kind of put blinders on it. It was just amazing, this period of fleeting freedom, until we realized that the cage was, in fact, still there. And it also meant a re-engagement in the West Bank. It was a way for the Israeli occupation to consolidate their hold on the West Bank. In that same period, where 7,000 settlers were moved to Gaza, Israeli authorities created room for 30,000 new settlers in the West Bank. And I'll use a map of that in a little bit. And what we saw it as, it was sort of a way, it was sort of an evolution of the occupation. It was a more strategic kind of occupation where the Israeli military was no longer at direct risk or threat inside the Gaza Strip, as it was previously. It could kind of do what it needed to do remotely, control Gaza remotely. And it brought up the whole end of occupation debate, which we hear till this day, often the retorts of, well, Gaza's no longer occupied. Well, we left, what more do they want? Becomes a very crucial element. And here, just quickly, a few images of those few days I was talking about when I was there. It was really an incredible period. Seeing these Palestinians scaling the wall that just a few days earlier, this would have been unthinkable. I mean, this is akin to the fall of the Berlin Wall. If you got within 100 meters of this wall, you would be sniped to death. And those were under orders given by the Israeli High Court. Anyone approaching within 100 meters, you have a right to shoot to kill any moving object. And there were scores of, I remember one Palestinian mother I interviewed whose 8-year-old daughter on her way to school was shot with her backpack on just because she was too close to an Israeli watchtower. And I will just never forget. I mean, the mother could speak a little, but it was really the father who was struggling. He couldn't even say a word, utter a word, so he didn't know what to say. I mean, that was sort of my first experience, very showing you how personal the occupation is. So again, and here again, scaling, going through that wall that divided them from Egypt. And these are boys going through the seams of a barricaded Israeli colony of Neve Dekalim, which the Khan Yunis refugee camp overlooked by like the distance from where I am to where you're sitting, literally. And this was dividing it, and they could see it from, but they couldn't access the rooftops of the refugee camp where they had orders that they needed a permit to get to the roof. And I remember one woman jokingly saying, I needed to do my laundry, and my washing machine was on the ceiling, and I got orders from the Israeli military saying you need to apply for a security clearance in order to do your laundry. So this is the daily life of Palestinians. They often trivialize it and make jokes of it, and they say this, we never know whether it's actually laugh or cry about our situation. But so they could never even get near not only the settlement, but the beach that was just beyond that settlement was reserved for those settlers. It was strictly off limits for more than 7 years for the Palestinians of the Gaza Strip. And they just literally swarmed. The first thing they did, they swarmed the beach, and they just kind of basking in the waters that were off this. This is again, on the left-hand side is Gaza, on the right-hand side is Egypt. Again, this deadly corridor. This is sort of a no man's corridor, a buffer zone where the Israeli military machines would nest and rest before coming out for invasions into the Rafah refugee camp. A very deadly corridor that, again, it was just unthinkable to not even to step foot in it, but to even get near, like I said, within 100 meters of it. So to just see people weaving across it was really quite a sight. And here with those two boys again. This is a man holding a picture of, as you can see, a sign that said warning electric fence that surrounded the settlements. So you had the settlement, and then you had a gap of 70 meters, what was called a security zone, and then an additional 30 meters. This is a Palestinian photojournalist that had a vest of these pictures, and I asked what this was about, and he said these were all images that he had taken, that he had covered, you know, these victims, child victims of the Israeli military campaign and occupation in Gaza. He said he didn't want people to forget what they died for, and he wanted them to sort of witness this, at that time, what was seen as a momentous occasion with them. As I mentioned, there was a lot of excitement associated with the disengagement. There was this huge $11 million campaign funded by the U.S. State Department that would become significant later. It was an effort to prop up the Fatah regime ahead of expected elections a few months later. And it was, this sign says, the people liberate, the people build. And there was this whole rebranding Gaza campaign, and there was other ones that were reclaiming our gem. Things like this, Gaza is returning to us, let's take care of it. Very optimistic, kind of, you know, warm and fuzzy campaign. And I should mention, nobody knew what to expect after this engagement, including the then Fatah-controlled Palestinian Authority. There was zero, if any, coordination up until the very last day. I was in close touch with officials on both sides, and as I was reporting on this, about what this meant for Palestinians. What would this mean for the Palestinian borders, very significantly. As you saw all those borders are controlled by outside forces, what would this mean for Palestinian economy, for commerce, for the goods? And in fact, many Palestinian and other economists and experts said, look, the disengagement isn't going to mean squat unless Israel can guarantee movement and access for Palestinian goods and people. Without that access and movement, the Palestinian economy will collapse, and Gaza is going to become worse off. And indeed, that's exactly what happened. These are images of the Palestinian airport I talked about. This is a bombed radar, and this is just the front image. It was subsequently gone further after this. The sign down there says, Gaza International Airport welcomes you. So it's kind of a grim image. These are Palestinians sort of reclaiming this Israeli sniper tower. So now we get to the disengagement and the policy behind the disengagement. This is an advisor. He was an advisor to then Prime Minister Ariel Sharon and then to Ehud Olmert, the current Prime Minister. And in being asked about the disengagement, he said, the disengagement is actually formaldehyde. It supplies the amount of formaldehyde necessary so that there will not be a political process with the Palestinians. It is a concept, it is a policy, it is a campaign intended to put the political process on hold indefinitely. Politicide. And that's exactly how it shaped out to be. Here I talked about the disengagement as a re-engagement in the West Bank, or an engagement in the West Bank, and how room for 30,000 new illegal settlers in the West Bank. And now we get to that fourth stub on the little disengagement thing, which was end of occupation debate. People thought, okay, what does this mean for the legal status of Gaza? Will this mean the end of occupation? What does that mean anyway? Ariel Sharon, before he went into a coma, went to the UN and said, he declared the end of Israeli control and responsibility for Gaza. Not say it was an end of occupation, and it was purposeful, but notice he said end of responsibility. So, did the disengagement end the occupation? What determines that, and what are the legal consequences? End of occupation is an end of effective control, which is control over major aspects of sovereignty, population registry. I talked about the issuance of ID cards. Israel still controls that issuance of ID cards. That mandates who can get in and out of Gaza, including families, as I mentioned. That mandates where and how you can move from Gaza to the West Bank and other places. It's control over borders, airspace, taxation system, maritime access, all of these things. And here in the Fourth Geneva Convention, the occupier is responsible for the welfare of the citizens it is occupying, etc. Again, why is this significant? We get to that later. Because, in fact, Israel did none of these things. And the way he got around it was by declaring Gaza a hostile entity, and therefore was no longer responsible for providing any of those things, even though it still was an effective control of Gaza. It said, it's a hostile entity, we don't have to give electricity. So, and in fact, decided to cut electricity deliberately. Took a decision and said, you know, there was an Israeli soldier that was captured, we're going to punish the population of Gaza, we're going to cut off the electricity, punitive electricity cuts, which of course resulted also in limited water access because the generators were powered by electricity, the water pumps and so forth, restricted fuel, and so on and so forth, and said we don't have to, we're not obligated to do anything. No, we didn't end the occupation, but Gaza is a hostile entity, we're not in charge. And not only that, but it also began to further restrict the borders and the access and the movement for people and for goods. So the result, a 100-page report by Gisha, an NGO in Israel for the protection of freedom of movement, that Israel had not in fact relinquished control, but rather removed some elements of control and tightening, significantly tightening others. Continued to control life in Gaza, as I mentioned, through an invisible hand. I talked about this, the occupation becoming more and more invisible. Borders, airspace, water, population registry, taxation. You know, the way my children's right to go to Gaza, again, is contingent upon Israeli approval. They can't get in unless Israel decides that it's okay. Same thing with my husband. And this still applies. Control over the ability of the government to function. And the outcome. And again, we're still talking here about a time before the Palestinian elections, remember. Far from improving the economy, what happened was that the disengagement resulted in a period of unprecedented poverty and unemployment in Gaza. Unprecedented in 38 years of occupation. From a process that was supposed to result in the freeing of Gaza, the liberating of Gaza, and Gaza's economy flourishing and sort of taking off, even though it was not a state, it was severed from the West Bank, from East Jerusalem, severed from the world. So what happened next? What happened after disengagement? Israel was no longer in Gaza. We saw new waves of control. The military campaign, the occupation began to manifest themselves in different ways. Instead of checkpoints within Gaza, there was a tightening of border control and perimeter control around Gaza. There was new artillery fire from Israeli tanks, and they were given permission to fire within 100 meters of civilian locations. There were sonic boom raids, F-16 jets breaking the sound barrier over Gaza. Again, it was in a punitive manner, used as a way to sort of pressure and punish the population. And I mean, it's more horrifying, if I can describe it, than a regular attack, in the sense that you don't know what's hitting you, you don't hear the plane. You just all of a sudden hear this thunderous explosion, and you feel like your insides are going to just burst out, and everything is shaking, and you just kind of get disoriented and shocked and hysterical, and then you just feel like you want to run somewhere and you don't know where. That's the best way to describe a sonic boom raid. And this was happening at a certain period on a daily basis, every half an hour. We saw prolonged border closures, food and supply shortages, and then eventually the elections. And then I talked about the punitive electricity cuts, new ways, new devices. They voted on cutting electricity to Gaza. This is just a satellite image of Gaza and these three main crossings that I'll be referring to. So what happened was that there was a lot of money invested into Gaza, as there often is, to try to jumpstart its economy after disengagement. There was many EU projects, World Bank projects. One of them was a cherry tomato project and a strawberry palm project in the greenhouses left behind in the settlements. And cherry tomatoes and strawberries grow in off-season in Gaza, where they wouldn't grow in Europe in the winter in the rest of the world. And they do quite well, and they're exported usually to Europe, to the West Bank, and even to Israel. What happened was that because of these extensive border closures, so in January of 2006, just a few months after disengagement, before elections, I should say, before elections, without reason or cause, Israel decided to completely seal the Gaza crossing, the Gaza commercial crossings and other crossings. At the time, they said we're suspecting there's something on the border crossing. They did 3 different security checks. At that time, the President controlled PA, the World Bank even got involved, others, the UN got involved, said everything was clear, open the crossings. They wouldn't open it, they wouldn't let any trucks through, wouldn't let anything in. The result was that 100 tons of strawberries, carnations, which were also grown there and shipped, cherry tomatoes, peppers, spoiled, 100 tons. Were just dumped. I remember the farmers didn't know what to do with them. They were dumped in the local market, and then the ones that spoiled were just dumped in local dumps and so forth. The result was people like this man, Riyad Nahmani, with whom I met twice over the course of a year. I went once to meet him, and then I did a follow-up trip with him. He's a strawberry farmer, a very simple man, in the area of northern Gaza known as Beit Lahia, which you probably heard a lot about in the recent invasion. It was very, very heavily hit. It's a farming area. It's a huge area. Most of those farms now destroyed in the recent attack. Again, he was very hopeful. I had gone to ask him about, his view on the elections and how he would vote. And he was very hopeful. He said, I have the strawberry farm. I'm a little concerned because the Carney closure. I have all these strawberries that I grew. They did really well this year, but I haven't been able to export any of them. This is January '06. But he said he's going to vote anyway, and he voted Palestinian Front for the PFLP. It's a good opportunity to mention that Gaza's politics are quite diverse. People often get this impression that it's like Hamas, but there's many other parties, vast political spectrum. Anyway, he voted, and the following year when I went to visit him, he said it was just completely, what's the expression for the basically his farm was destroyed. He had no money. Many hungry mouths to feed. He said that, I lost everything I had from the closure. I didn't have enough money to grow the next year. And so he was just out of work, out of farm. And it also affected people like this woman, a 54-year-old livestock farmer. She raises chickens and rabbits and things like that. She supports 18 people, 12 of her own, including her 2 sons and their families who are unemployed. She sells these on the streets of the Nusayrat refugee camp Tuesday market every week. And this woman, Khadija Sultan, she's 72 years old. She's out there every Thursday in the Gaza City market of Sheikh Ridwan selling her vegetables from the village of Beit Hanun in northern Gaza. Increasingly, we were seeing these images of women being the breadwinners of their families, with the majority of Gaza unemployed, 80% now. Now, the result of this perimeter artillery fire that I was talking about were many innocent victims, like 9-year-old Habil Ghabed, whose family I visited, she was in her house, in her living room at the time when a shell got a direct hit in her living room from this Israeli shell from the perimeter, and she was killed. Her brother was blinded. These are what these shells look like, the ones I was talking about. And this is I should mention, very mild comparison to what occurred in January. But this was a man, I don't think I have this picture here, but his name is Salah, and he lives in the very northernmost area of the Gaza Strip, the furthest north you can go with the border with Israel. And Israel in the end detained him after I talked to him, and no longer lives there, but him and his family of 14 were there, and he said we can't use our second floor, third floor, fourth floor. Every movement is subject to, there was an Israeli watchtower that continued to move the house that could hold every movement. But they would find these all over their house and would make bases out of them. Okay, and then Rafah crossing. Remember, you saw that on the map up there. This is sort of the vein of resistance to the Palestinians in Gaza. The only way in and out of Gaza at any given moment. He could never, ever know when it would be open or not, subject to complete arbitrary closure. And if at all it was open, it was only open for a few frustrating, painstaking hours at a time. And this was throughout the years. It was not something. The past 3 years, it's been effectively completely closed, save for a few days here and there. But through my years from 2003 up to 2007, I've never had an easy time getting out. I mean, it's taken me 36 hours at one point, anywhere from 12 hours to 36 hours to get through. And you can see here the masses of people accumulating. What happens is this bottleneck. So you have 1.5 million people. You only exit in and out of Gaza. I mean, akin to just Edmonton being surrounded, but again, like I mentioned, twice the population. And then literally all bordered. Just imagine a huge wall around Edmonton. You can't use the airport. At the Edmonton airport, there's just no way out except this. And when it is open, you just get an announcement a few hours before it's going to open. Everyone rushes there. So at any given time, thousands of people. And what happens is you can see they pile up on the buses. Everyone crams in and waits and waits and waits, whether it's winter or summer. And it's just the most frustrating. And every time and Yusuf, my son, endured all of this with me. He knows it very well. And that scene happened to us with the baby. Once I was in and he was out, and someone had to toss him in through the window to me. Because things can happen so quickly, and you could be waiting for 6 hours, and then you'll hear a little movement, and everybody will get excited, and we're moving a little bit, and then you wait for another 3 hours, and this is Rafah. And this was the way we got in and out. And I always say, any airport delay or travel for me now is breeze, in comparison to during Rafah. This was on our most recent trip there in June 2007, the last time I was able to get in. I haven't been able to go back to the border closure. And this was just on the bus that we were on, and you could see the many hundreds of people waiting, and the many, many buses of people. And you have to walk this long strip basically to get to the front. But no word about how far you're advancing, are you getting through, are you not? You're just waiting and waiting. When Yusuf was about 2.5 once, we were trying to get in, and similarly we were stuck near the border on the Egyptian side. And that was the first time I remember him being cognizant enough to actually ask me questions about, why the border was closed. And it was something I relayed in my blog, and then Israeli journalist Gideon Levy wrote about in Haaretz, where he just asked me, why can't we go home? And I said, well, the border is closed. And he said, well, why is it closed? What did we do? Or first he said, who's closing it? And I said, well, there's just, there's a group of people. Some of them are good, and some are not so good, and they're the ones that are not so good are closing the border. And he said, well, why are they closing it? What did we do? Why are they preventing me from going home? And, that's at one point you just don't know what to say to him anymore. And so I wrote this letter to, at that time, the Israeli Defense Minister, Amir Peretz, which actually was sent to him and was published in the newspaper, but, I'm sure it went to the bin. But the point is that, this is the thing, the beginning of, the cognizance of the Palestinian existence and reality at such a young age. Young age is knowing such big words, little boy men, and having to come to grips with this, force that's controlling every aspect of your life and dividing your families apart and dividing you from the things you love and the things you don't, and the very ordinary and the very mundane. That's what the occupation does, and that's what the situation is in Gaza. This is Yusuf on a bus during one of those trips across Rafah. These are Palestinian fishermen. Another industry hit very hard because of Israeli control over maritime access, over Gaza's sea access. They're often detained, often shot at with live ammunition and with water guns, often tortured. Here you can see the gradual reduction in Gaza fishermen's zones of fishing. Oslo was supposed to give them the so-called right of 20 nautical miles into sea. 2002, that was reduced to 12 nautical miles, and most recently it's been reduced anywhere between 4 and 6, depending on the day. And that also gives you a very good idea, again, of the complete isolation of Gaza by sea, land, and air there. This is a man who lives in a village called Siafa in the westernmost point of Gaza. And it's a village, it used to be sandwiched between 3 illegal settlements, Israeli settlements, and they always had to go through this checkpoint, and they still do now. It is in this area called the no-go zone of northern Gaza. And the only way they can get in is they can only go in at certain hours of the day, at certain days of the week, with a plastic bag, with, so it's very limited medical access, schools, etc. But it's still an area that's very isolated within, obviously, the larger isolation of Gaza. This is Atimad Abonara. She's a mother of over now 11,000 Palestinian prisoners. Most of them imprisoned without charge. Now it's akin, and every week they hold these protests in front of the Red Cross and in front of the Palestinian Parliament so people can remember them and remember the plight of the Palestinian prisoners. Now it's akin, I should say, 1 in 5 Palestinians since 1967 has been detained by Israel. That is akin to, I should have done this in figures, I apologize, but it's akin to 60 million Americans. 60 million Americans. And these are more pictures of these mothers. They're very vocal in demanding the rights of the Palestinian prisoners. This is again an image taken along that border, the Rafah border with Egypt. In this case, it was during a film that I made about the tunnels in 2007, before the tunnels became such a big issue this year. At that time, it was called tunnel trade, and this was sort of a bull's head that someone had put marking a spot along the Rafah crossing. And it was a business that has flourished in recent years, directly correlated with border closures. So that's sort of what we got from all of our interviews with the tunnel lords and the way it works its way down the system, is that it's a business, and like any business, when supply and demand, and he said when the crossing is open, we have very little work, and when it's not, we have a lot of work. And it's just across the board. And since the time that I was there, 2007, till today, it's moved from becoming a black market to sort of a gray market. what I mean by that is now above ground. It used to be completely underground, and you could tell which goods were smuggled through the tunnels in the local shops in the Rafah. Like these were tunnel cigarettes, this is tunnel cheese. But now it's I mean, just to give you an idea, a few weeks before the Gaza invasion, my dad said, I just got a generator because electricity was getting more and more intermittent, and he said, but the ones in Gaza are really expensive, so I just bought one from the tunnel market. And what's that? He said, that's now it's the official market. You go there, and it's like the goods that come through, everything from electricity generators, fuel, livestock, car parts. At that time, 2007, the biggest selling item was smartphones. So just all sorts of things. This is a boy, his name is Ibrahim, 15 years old, that I interviewed, and he's a tunnel digger. And he makes about, $300 in a dig. And I talked to him in length about this, and he said to me, I was just talking to him about it. Is it worth it? Why are you doing this? And he said, well, if it works out just once, you're set for life. He said, you'll go up in life, you'll make it big, and then you get everything you need. And he just kind of paused, and he said, my dream is just to get a house, to get a car, to live. He said, like in Arabic, he said, I used to say, to live like a doctor, meaning live like a king. He said, no one tells me where to do or what to go. I can just sit in my house. That's all I want to do. I just want to sit in my house. No one talk to me. And that was his dream. And this is Gaza. This is Gaza's youth. Half of them under 14 years old. Now we get to January '06. And again, I was there throughout the elections, throughout the parliamentary elections. It's a very, just like the disengagement, it was a very amazing time for Gaza. Why? Because you felt this excitement reverberating throughout Gaza, a lot of energy. People were, Gaza is a very, very depressing place. I mean, you're there long enough and you feel like you're going to suffocate. That's why I have that poem that I always put on the first slide of my presentations by Mahmoud Darwish saying the earth is closing in on us. That's exactly, sometimes you want to run away and there's nowhere to run to. You go to the beach, you're just enclosed on all sides. And you literally feel like things are just getting more and more enclosed to the point where where else can you go? And so it's notable when there's a time when you feel this energy, you feel this optimism and this excitement. And the weeks leading up to the elections were was marked by intense campaigning on all sides. You were getting robocalls from the different parties. Vote for there was hotlines. That for each of the parties. I remember Fatah had a hotline, and I did a series of five articles for The Guardian at the time about the elections. And in one of them, I just decided to call up one of the hotlines, Fatah, and I have a blog entry about it where I just asked, there was this energetic young guy, and I said, well, what can you tell me about Fatah's new campaign? What about the corruption? And he said, oh no, we've changed. Yeah, everyone has mistakes. Their message was kind of acknowledging their past mistakes at that time and trying to move forward. They said, but we're new now, and remember, we were the first ones, and this and that. And so it was kind of a neat time to see everyone so engaged in the political system, whether it was Fatah or Hamas or the PFLP or the independents. A lot of independents ran. And a lot of campaigning, like I said, on all sides. Each of them had their websites. So what happened was that the Hamas party, called the Change and Reform Party, they built their campaign around the idea of change and reform, which was, right, so at that time, first and foremost in people's mind were two things. The border issue, like I talked about, even before the elections, after disengagement, the borders had just been a complete wreck for Palestinians. The economy had collapsed, but most importantly, the security situation, the internal security situation. We were seeing higher and higher incidences of lawlessness, criminality, thuggery, people were being, journalists were being kidnapped, something we had never seen in Gaza before. Random criminality, car theft, there were these gangs that were, stealing cars and then demanding, ransom for them, etc. What happened was that, it was a surprise to everyone, including them, and Hamas won. And I remember clearly that night there was Hamad Dahalan, who was sort of the Fatah strongman that was propped by the US and the CIA, it would later be known, and Mahmoud Zahar, who was sort of the head of the Hamas political wing, were on a show on LBC, Lovely's Broadcasting, and they were talking just hours before the elections were announced. And the woman was talking to them, and they were bickering back and forth about, Fatah's torturing of Zahar and others in the 90s, and Hadan saying, yeah, let's forget about the past. And remember I signed this great agreement. Fatah signed an agreement, I should have mentioned, right after disengagement, called the Agreement of Movement and Access with Israel. And it was meant to guarantee Palestinian control over the crossing within a year. Condoleezza Rice brokered the agreement, and she said it was meant to grant them freedom of access that they deserve and they require to live a free life. And of course that never happened. What happened was that instead Israel installed video cameras and it was in charge of all the passenger lists of who would go in and out of Rafah, and continued to close it arbitrarily to allow European monitors only to go in and out depending on when it wanted to close the crossing or not. Anyway, but that was kind of Fatah's big thing. They were saying, this is what we did, our accomplishment, the agreement and Rafah crossing. And then Zahar said something like, we're going to have a little surprise for you tonight. We've been doing exit polling, and I think the results are going to surprise everyone. And the announcer and the man were talking about, and everybody was like, what's he talking about? Anyway, then it would be known that that night they in fact won. It was several votes. It was not a homogeneous vote. It was largely defined by several things. Votes against Fatah. So many Fatah people I talked to said we voted for Fatah because we voted against Fatah. Others said it was a vote of disillusionment, 10 years of process and no peace, of an accord that promised nothing more than limited Palestinian self-governance, an accord that did not have any mention of Palestinian statehood. So many others said, let's try something different. Right now, the only thing we can really change and with our vote is the domestic situation, not the larger political one. We can change the way that our government operates locally, the security situation domestically, the social welfare network, that kind of thing, the management of every day-to-day affairs, which Hamas had a good track record of. This is a pre-election rally, 10,000 women that had attended the rally the day before the elections. Very active in campaigning, I should mention. These were internet exit polling stations set up in front of all the different voting centers across Gaza. This one was run by Hamas. They had vans shuttling people, transporting people to the polls. What happened next was sort of a bit of a conundrum for the quartet, shaped by the UN, Russia, US, and anyway. The point is they didn't know what to do because they didn't expect the results, and they in fact encouraged the elections. And not only did they encourage the elections, they did not hinder them, but they also found them to be free and fair elections in the Arab Middle East. They said this is something remarkable. And so they couldn't just say we'll reject the results outright because they didn't stop the elections to start with. So instead they created these preconditions on the Hamas government, and they immediately slapped sanctions on that government and the people of Gaza. Included withholding tax revenues by Israel, $52 million in tax revenues that I talked about the effective control of disengagement. That's what it gave them the right to do, to withhold tax revenues at the beginning. They in fact agreed then to a unity government. They said, well, let me go to the three conditions that were placed that we hear about constantly reiterated in the press. Renounce armed struggle, recognize Israel, and accept past peace deals. The response from the Palestinians was, first of all, in any negotiating situation, one party is not a priori forced to give up its demands and meet certain conditions before it enters negotiations. Second of all, they said, what border are we recognizing here? What border? Is it the Israel of 48, the Israel of 67, the Israel of the annexation wall? Then they say, let it be reciprocal. Let Israel recognize a Palestinian state. There's no mention of Palestinian statehood anywhere in Oslo. In fact, the charter of the current Israeli government specifically says that they flatly reject the establishment of a Palestinian state. So they said these preconditions cannot be realistically met. They were just made to, another way to kind of go around the election results. What happened was that there was this effort to create a unity government. There was this spate of intense Palestinian infighting. Again, a period that I was there and witnessed. It was just, the movement was paralyzed. It was, things had gotten really to a low point in Gaza. And then it was later discovered there was this $84 million CIA-funded attempt at a coup in Gaza. It was an article, it's something that we researched and knew with Palestinians. I talked to several people. I had a long interview called An Eye for an Eye for Gaza with people on the Fatah side, with what were called the death squads that were involved in this and then acknowledged. But it officially became public in an article called The Gaza Bombshell in Vanity Fair. So what happened was that in being asked, again, this guy Dov Weisglass, to define the policy towards the PA after the elections, this guy Weisglass said, well, the idea behind the sanction is to put Palestinians on a diet but not make them die of hunger. In other words, to punish Palestinians just enough. We don't want, every few months when there's enough of an outcry, we'll allow in a trickle of humanitarian aid, and then everybody will be quiet again. And, which is why Palestinians frequently say that's, we don't want handouts. We want a resolution. We want an end to the occupation. We want an end to the siege. We want open borders. It's not like every few months the government will be complicit in choking Gaza and bombing Gaza, and by proxy, and then they'll pay for its reconstruction, and so on and so forth. And this is actually a quote from a guy, I think, in the EU that said, it's so frustrating because, every few months, Israel will bomb and destroy, and then we fund and repair, and bomb and destroy, fund and repair. So anyway, this was the idea, not put them on, not kill them of hunger, but put them on a diet. And this was the result in March, was what was referred to as the counter-coup by Hamas. Fatah was evicted from Gaza. Gaza's isolation came full circle, was completely sealed, and the next day the borders were closed until they are today, completely closed, completely. No few hours of operation anymore, nothing. And Egypt became complicit with the U.S. and Israel in closing them, crossing them at this point. So, but then back to this Operation January. People in Gaza felt it was coming. My dad would keep telling me, something's going to happen, something's going to happen. And he got the generator because he said, I feel like something's going to happen. And it did, and the result was, over 1,300 Palestinians killed, a third of them women and children, majority civilian non-combatants. We've heard the statistics and the figures, so I don't want to belabor them too much. The purpose was, they sort of kept changing, but in the end, the Israeli stated purpose was to change the equation, increase Israeli deterrence. What Palestinians saw was, I talked again about this overriding policy of politicide, the way that they bombed the civilian and security infrastructure when Fatah was in power in the beginning of the Second Republic. The purpose was to collapse the infrastructure of civil governance, law and order, kill the political prospect, punish the civilian population, same as it was at the beginning of the Second Republic when Fatah was in power. It doesn't make a difference who's in power so much. We've heard the narrative and the propaganda. We've heard the Gaza as Hamasistan, Gaza as Al-Qaeda, rockets were landing in your backyard, something that was adopted and reiterated by almost every U.S. politician on every channel. What would the U.S. do? There is no Palestinian partner. There is never a Palestinian partner to deal with. It's a terrorist government. We do not negotiate with terrorists. Something that was reiterated time and time again, no matter who was in power on the Palestinian side, whether it was Mahmoud Abbas or before him, Yasser Arafat, and many who are familiar with the situation will recall a time when Arafat was, their favorite, and then after Camp David, he was a guy that they could not negotiate with, and then came up with Abbas, and so on and so forth. There's never a Palestinian partner. That on one hand, we have the myth of enlightened occupation, that we are a moral army, we're doing this for the sake of Gazans. We want to free them, rid them of this terrorist regime. But on the other hand, Gazans are complicit. They chose this terrorist government, and they're not doing enough to stop these rockets from being fired. That we have no choice. Hamas is hiding, this human shielding behind the civilian infrastructure, so it's all collateral damage. That we do our best to avoid civilian casualties. And so this was the Israeli narrative. And then sort of filling in the blanks. So and that's why I go to great lengths to give you the context behind all of this, just to really see what was happening before all of this. What was happening before the Palestinian elections, before the disengagement, after the disengagement. What I refer to as disengagement from justice. The overriding concept, again, of politicide. It being about the occupation. And again, it's not just Gaza here, that so much of the focus is on Gaza. Remember, Gaza is completely separated from the West Bank, also under Israeli occupation, almost completely pacified now, completely torn apart by illegal Israeli colonies and the annexation wall, torn apart from Jerusalem. Jerusalem itself is Jerusalem under occupation, suffering its own set from different Israeli policies, including, I talked about the population registry. As a Palestinian resident of East Jerusalem, if you do not renew your residency there every few years, if you're a student and you're in the U.S. as an East Jerusalemite and you can't for some reason go back to renew your residency, you will lose your right to return to your own home. As a Jew of that city, it does not apply. In fact, you can be a Jew from anywhere in the world, trace your Jewish ancestry 4 generations back, and immediately land in Israel and get citizenship. Whereas if you are a resident, and I'm not even talking about a native of that land like my husband, if you're even a resident according to Israeli definitions and you're just gone for a few years, you can't come back. So again, it shows you these racist policies that are integrated in the Israeli system. Not just in Gaza, West Bank, and East Jerusalem. Completely separated from one another. Palestinian society completely severed. Palestinian ties, family ties, social ties, severed. Because of this ongoing occupation in all areas, and throughout getting back to the invasion, we heard about the ceasefire in place. Before the ceasefire, there was ongoing settlement expansion there in the West Bank, ongoing detentions of Palestinians. I talked about 11,000 Palestinian prisoners. Ongoing illegal assassinations of Palestinians in Gaza and in the West Bank. There was a great article in The Guardian by an Israeli that was from the, what is it, the movement? No, I'm not accusing, I'm trying to think of their name. They have a name, it's a group of Israeli soldiers that are no longer, they're not accused because they were in some way involved and then they kind of come out and speak. But anyway, it's a lengthy article with an Israeli soldier who was involved directly in assassinating Palestinians, and he talks about in length about the policy. It was like 2 days ago. And then again, these unprecedented preconditions placed on the democratically elected government, and the boycott, which former UN envoy John Dugard has said, unprecedented in modern history that a boycott is placed against an occupied people. Unprecedented. I mean, it's just, it's become something like so, by the way, it's just, acceptable and normal. Yeah, Gaza is this crazy stand, whatever, we need to sanction, boycott them, bomb the hell out of them. It's okay. We forget, we're talking about an occupied territory here, stateless people, most of them refugees here. And these are just some images that my father took of homes that were completely destroyed in the second invasion. This is the Samuni family, which you may have heard about. They lost 48 members at once. They were asked to leave, evicted from their homes, carrying white flags. They were all asked to huddle into one home. Many of them killed through summary execution. Others, the home was directly targeted. And these are for the surviving members. Set up a tent where their house used to be. They were serving tea to visitors. This is a mosque, one of over 15, that was completely demolished. One of the things that this invasion saw was not only summary execution of civilians and deliberate systematic targeting of civilian buildings and locations and homes and farms and factories and schools, but also places of worship, churches and mosques, I should say, not just mosques. Okay, now I want to, again, sort of backtrack a little bit. We heard a lot about this invasion. We don't hear a lot about the direct impact of the siege that has been in place since the democratic elections that affected people like 5-year-old Abdel. It was stage 4 liver cancer. And because of the complete hermetic sealing of Gaza, and because of this list that was created by Israel of essential goods that are allowed into Gaza and non-essential ones that are not, chemotherapy is not allowed into Gaza anymore, chemotherapy drugs. And in his case, he was also could not get out of Gaza because the border closed. And so he died, he's not dead yet, but he's dying a slow and painful death. A colleague of mine from the medical relief organization in the US was just there last week and took his picture and shared it with me, and said the most he could do for him, he's an anesthesiologist, was drain his fluid in his liver, because it was so bloated. He has less than 3 months to live. Or, like 4-year-old Abdullah Shawwa, who has an easily diagnosable and treatable kidney tumor that's largely found in children, called the Wills kidney tumor. It was diagnosed 8 months ago. He was denied exit by Israel, to Egypt, to Israel, to Europe, to anywhere, and again, no chemotherapy. And in this case, Dr. Ismail was removed one of his kidneys, and he said ordinarily the size of a kidney would be the size of a human fist. In a child's case, it would be very small. In his case, his kidney that was extracted was the size of a football. These are the people that are suffering as a direct result of the Israeli siege. Ongoing before and after. Before and after. And, just some facts again about this, what's happening in Gaza. We often heard in the recent invasion that, at least initially, Hamas broke, there was a ceasefire, Hamas broke it, we were suffering for 8 years from rockets, we had no choice but to respond, self-defense, blah, 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 blah. Actually, by the Israeli government's own admission, Ehud Barak and others in charge of the Israeli defense committees and the Knesset. This invasion was planned for more than a year, and the Israeli government, in fact, had no intention of renewing the ceasefire. In fact, in June of 2008, they decided on the ordinance they would need for the Gaza invasion, and it was delivered to them by the United States in September 2008, including 1,000 bunker buster bombs. In any case, they broke the ceasefire on November 4th after killing first a farmer and then assassinating 6 other Palestinians. And in response, the rockets began to fly again. That in any case, as I talked about, Israel had not lived up. You think of this as just a simple, tit for tat. Well, the ceasefire was broken, the rockets go, Israel responds to something else. In reality, part of that ceasefire agreement, and again, we're not even talking here about the ongoing occupation everywhere else, overall in Gaza, West Bank, East Jerusalem, but part of that ceasefire obligation was to lift the siege on Gaza, to open the borders, to allow the Palestinians to live their lives, to treat their injured, to go to their universities, to see their families. That did not happen. The siege continued to be in place throughout the period of the so-called ceasefire. Humanitarian aid was only trickling in. Despite the ceasefire that was renewed last month after the invasion, Israeli gunboats continued to fire towards the coastline, injuring dozens of Palestinian fishermen. We talked about that limit that they're given to fishing 4 to 6 miles. That throughout the invasion, Israel prevented all media from entering Gaza. Before media that were already there. And we heard a lot about, the human shielding in Gaza, and there's a whole separate little discussion about that. But another fact that Israel itself has used in the past, and this is something I personally reported on in Rafah. I talked a little bit about first going to Rafah and reporting there, visiting with families that were themselves used as not only held in position torture, but themselves asked to scope out buildings, go to that building, see if there's anyone in there, so that if someone shoots, they get shot first. This was also documented in the case of this most recent invasion by Amnesty and Ben Salem and others. Another interesting fact I think many people don't know is that in 2006, the majority of Israeli public actually favored negotiations with the democratically elected government in Gaza. I talked about this, the fact that Israel has never recognized or states its intention to recognize the Palestinian state. It's often stated as a given that, the Palestinians, and the onus, again, always on the Palestinians. The burden is on the Palestinians, not only to provide for Israel's security, but it's always a given that it's Palestinian violence that is the cause, rather than Israeli occupation, siege, assassination, settlement expansion. That the cause of ceasefire breakings and so forth, and the cause of the Palestinian state not coming to be, when there has in fact never been a safe intention for a state. And you saw those 2 boys, the cancer-stricken boys. 262 Palestinians died as a direct result of the Israeli siege because of being unable to access medical care. Recently, last week, my mother's best friend passed away also from cancer conditions, unable to get it treated. And here we see just some more statistics of what's been happening in the West Bank with ongoing settlement expansion and tensions and so forth. This is just briefly a thing about the rockets. Interesting. It was done by this woman in the Huffington Post in the U.S. And she actually went and, again, not to reduce it to rockets. I talked a lot about why this is not about rockets, but, for those wondering. And she took this from the Israeli consulate in New York City, and she found that actually during the stated period of the most recent ceasefire, rockets were almost 0. And just showing that it was the moment that the ceasefire was broken by Israel, that by and large, ceasefires are abided by the Palestinian side, and Israel has acknowledged that itself, has said that they know that ceasefires can be stuck to, but that's not their intention. They didn't want the ceasefire to continue. And again, just another figure showing that the overwhelming majority of the time, it's the Israeli side that breaks periods of so-called calm throughout the years. The invasion was marked by sort of unprecedented psychological warfare. An Israeli friend of mine said, "Do you know what Kasla means?" I haven't really talked about it. I said, "No." He said, "It's this. It's a song about a child receiving a dreidel for Hanukkah from it's actually its teacher, not an uncle. And it's caste led, and then the song goes on to say it's the finest quality." And he said the idea is it's sort of this, it exudes innocence and joy and excitement. And that was what they were trying to convey, at least in the Israeli public's mind. But of course, for the Gazan people, it was anything but innocent, anything but exciting, anything but joyful. They were also receiving on a regular basis, and my father would often, be tactile and be like, I just don't want to, we just unplug the phone. Every few minutes we're getting these calls saying, the government is coming to an end, leave your homes now. And everyone was getting these calls, and then they said, well, where do we go? I mean, someone would say, should we leave? Maybe not. They'd leave their homes, they get another call from the area they went to. And Gaza was completely encircled. Where does one run to? Where does one seek shelter? These are some of the images on the TV my father was getting. He was saying this clock, and then another image saying, leadership of Hamas, your time is running out. And then, these propaganda flyers that were being distributed everywhere, telling people to, because of the terrorist activity in your areas, we're looking out for your safety, and leave the area, etc. But I want to read you one thing from, one thing I'm working on now is this project with Beit Salem. It's akin to the shooting back project that they ran in Hebron, which is they equip Palestinians with cameras and they ask them to shoot back, film Israeli army in action, sort of, or what they were seeing from their lens, what the occupation looked like, how it manifested itself to them. So they're doing something similar in Gaza, and I'm helping with it. And but we're going to do a video blogging component. And so we've begun to sort of get a bunch of people together, young people, and one of them sent me a small entry, and I want to share with you. It's just kind of in line with this whole idea of the pervasiveness of the occupation and how maddening it is, how, here it is. So it was, Smile, You're in Gaza. It's very short, but it really touched me. And she's a young filmmaker, and aspiring filmmaker, and she said, maybe you should be smiling so that you don't end up being crazy. And perhaps your laughing may lead you to become crazy anyway. You're crazy here, regardless of how you behave. Lots of houses, every home has its own tragic story. Forgotten dreams, buried ambitions. And in the current period, everyone is living in a state of waiting and anticipation. Waiting and anticipation. Few know what they're waiting for, and many are just waiting. Many are just waiting for Godot, purely for the unknown. In my childhood, I had lots of ambitions and dreams, and I was very happy with them. But now I wish I had no ambition. I wish I had no dreams. Perhaps that way it would be easier. I wish I was stupid. For sure, my understanding of my reality would definitely have been better. And this is Gaza. This is what Gaza has become. This is what Gaza is. And yeah, I guess I'll end there. There's so much more.